Contracts were made with an astrophysicist, Professor Joseph Hynek, also a prominent scientist, still unidentified, and a group of evaluation experts, Rand Corporation. Arrangements were made for services by the Air Weather Service, Andrews Field, the U.S. Weather Bureau, the Electronics Laboratory, Cambridge Field Station, the AMC Aeromedical Laboratory, the Army and Navy Departments, the FBI, the Department of Commerce, Civil Aeronautics Administration, and various other government and private agencies. In addition, the services of rocket experts, guided missile authorities, space travel planners, and others, in the defense services or assigned to them, were made available as desired. Under the heading, How Incidents Are Investigated, the Project Saucer report says, contracts were made with an astrophysicist, Professor Joseph Hynek, also a prominent scientist, still unidentified, and a group of evaluation. But the hoaxes and crank letters in reality play a small part in Project Saucer. Actually, it is a serious, scientific business of constant investigation, analysis, and evaluation which thus far has yielded evidence pointing to the conclusion that much of the saucer scare is no scare at all, but can be attributed to astronomical phenomena, to conventional aerial objects, to hallucinations, and to mass psychology. But the mere existence of some yet unidentified flying objects necessitates a constant vigilance on the part of Project Saucer personnel and the civilian population. Investigation is greatly stepped up when observers report incidents as soon as possible to the nearest military installation or to headquarters, AMC, direct. A standard questionnaire is filled out under the guidance of interrogators. In each case, time, location, size and shape of object, approximate altitude, speed, maneuvers, color, length of time in sight, sound, etc., are carefully noted. This information is sent in its entirety, together with any fragments, soil photographs, drawings, etc., to headquarters AMC. Here, highly trained evaluation teams take over. The information is broken down and filed on summary sheets, plotted on maps and graphs, and integrated with the rest of the material, giving an easily comprehended overall picture. Duplicate copies on each incident are sent to other investigating agencies, including technical labs within the Air Materiel Command. These are studied in relation to many factors such as guided missile research activity, weather, and many others, atmospheric sounding balloon launchings, commercial and military aircraft flights, flights of migratory birds, and a myriad of other considerations which might furnish explanations. Generally, the flying objects are divided into 4 groups: flying discs, torpedo or cigar-shaped bodies with no wings or fins visible in flight, spherical or balloon-shaped objects, and balls of light. The first 3 groups are capable of flight by aerodynamic or aerostatic means and can be propelled and controlled by methods known to aeronautical engineers. As for the lights, their actions, unless they were suspended from a higher object or were the product of hallucination, remain unexplained. Eventually, reports are sent back to Project Saucer headquarters, often marking incidents closed. The project, however, is a young one. Much of its investigation is still underway. Currently, a psychological analysis is being made by AMC's Aeromedical Laboratory to determine what percentage of incidents are probably based on errors of the human mind and senses. Available preliminary reports now indicate that a great number can be explained away as ordinary occurrences which have been misrepresented as a result of these human errors. Near the end of the last page, a paragraph sum-tipped the report. The saucers are not a joke. Neither are they cause for alarm to the population. Many of the incidents already have answers. Meteors, balloons, falling stars, birds in flight, testing devices, etc. Some of them still end in question marks. From what I had learned on this trip, I strongly doubted the answer suggested. All but the testing devices. What did they mean by that? It could be a hint at guided missiles. They had already mentioned guided missile research activity in another spot. But if that was what lay behind this elaborate project, they would hardly be hinting at it. If the answer was space travel, then such hints made sense. They would be part of the cover-up plan. Everyone, including the Soviet Union, knew we were working on guided missiles. It would do no harm to use this as one of the myriad explanations for the flying saucers. I was still trying to figure it out when my plane let down for the landing at Washington. I had hoped by this time to know the truth about Project Saucer. Instead, it was a deeper mystery than ever. True, I had found out how they operated, outside of Wright Field. Some of the incidents had been enlightening. By now, I was certain that Project Saucer was trying hard to explain away the sightings and hide the real answer. Chapter 10. When I reached home, I found a brief letter from Ken Purdy. Dear Don, the Mantell and Eastern cases both look good. I don't see how they can brush them off. It looks more like the interplanetary answer to me, but we won't decide on treatment until we're sure. I had suggested 2 or 3 angles, if this proved the real answer. Who would be the best authority to check our disk operation theory and give us more details on directional control? I'd like to have it checked by 2 more engineers. Ken. Next day, I dug out my copy of Boyle's interview with D., the famous aircraft designer. Certainly the flying saucers are possible, the designer had told Boyle. Give me enough money and I'll build you one. It might have to be a model because the fuel would be a problem. If the saucers that have been seen came from other worlds, which isn't at all Buck Rogerish, they may be powered with atomic energy or by the energy that produces cosmic rays, which is many times more powerful, or by some other fuel or natural force that our research hasn't yet discovered. But the circular airfoil is quite feasible. It wouldn't have the stability of the conventional airplane, but it would have enormous maneuverability. It could rise vertically, hover, descend vertically, and fly at extremely high speed with the proper power. Don't take my word for it. Check with other engineers. Before looking up a private engineer I had in mind, I went to the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. The NCA is America's most authoritative source of aerodynamic knowledge. I knew they had already tried out disc-shaped airfoils, and I asked about this first. I found that two official NCA reports, Technical Note 539 and Report 431, discuss tests on circular and elliptical Clark Y airfoils. Both reports state that these designs were found practical. Later, I talked with one of the top engineers in the NCA. Without showing him D.'s sketch, I asked how a disc might operate. It could be built with variable direction jet or rocket nozzles, B said. The nozzles would be placed around the rim, and by changing their direction the disc could be made to rise and descend vertically. It could hover, fly straight ahead, and make sharp turns. Its direction and velocity would be governed by the number of nozzles operating, the power applied, and the angle at which they were tilted. They could be pointed toward the ground, rearward, in a lateral direction, or in various combinations. A disc flying level, straight ahead, could be turned swiftly to right or left by shifting the angles of the nozzles or cutting off power from part of the group. This method of control would operate in the Earth's atmosphere and also, using rocket power, in free space, where conventional controls would be useless. The method he had described was not the one which D had outlined. What about a rotating disc? I asked the NCA man. Suppose you had one with a stationary center and a large circular section rotating around it. The rotating part would have a camber built into it, or it would have slotted vanes. He gave me a curious look. Where'd you get that idea about the camber? I told him it had come to me from True. It could be done, he said. The slotted vanes method has already been tried. There's an engineer in Glendale, California, who's built a model. His name's E.W.K. He gave me a few details on how a cambered or slotted vane rotating disc might operate, then interrupted himself to ask me what I thought the saucers were. They're either interplanetary or some secret development, I said. What do you think? The NCA has no proof they even exist, he answered. When I left the building a few minutes later, I was still weighing that statement. If the Air Force or the Navy had a secret disk device, the NCA would almost certainly know about it. The chances were that any disc-shaped missile or new type of circular aircraft would first have been tested in the NCA wind tunnels at Langley Field. If the saucers were interplanetary, the NCA, at least top officials, would probably have been in on any discussion of the disk's performance. Either way, the NACA's official attitude could be expected to match the Pentagon's. After lunch, I took a taxi to the office of the private engineer. Like D, He has asked that he not be quoted by name. The name I am using, Paul Rettel, will serve that purpose. Rettel is a well-known aeronautical engineer. He has worked with major aircraft companies and served as a special consultant to government agencies and the industries. He is also a competent pilot. Although I had known him several years, he refused at first to talk about the saucers. Then I realized he thought I meant to quote him. I showed him some of the material I had roughed out, in which names were omitted or changed as requested. "All right," Rettel said finally. "What do you want to know?" "Anything you can tell us. But first, your ideas on these sketches." I showed him D.S. drawings and then gave him the high points of the investigation. When I mentioned the mystery light incident at Fairfield-Swayson Air Force Base, Rettel sat up quickly. "The Gorman case again." "We heard about some other light cases," I said. "One was at Las Vegas." "I know about that one. That is, if you mean the green light. Wait a minute." Rettel frowned into space for a few seconds. "You say that Fairfield-Swayson sighting was on December 3rd? Then the Las Vegas sighting was only a few days later. It was the first week of the month, I'm positive." "Those light reports have got me stumped," I said. "A light just can't fly around by itself. And those 2-foot discs." "You haven't worked on the Gorman case?" asked Rettel. I told him I hadn't thought it was coming up on my schedule. "Leave these sketches here," he said. "Look into that Gorman sighting. Then check on our plans for space exploration. I'll give you some sources. When you get through, come on back and we'll talk it over." The Gorman saucer dogfight had been described in newspapers. The pilot had reported chasing a swiftly maneuvering white light, which had finally escaped him. Judging from the Project Saucer preliminary report, this case had baffled all the Air Force investigators. When I met George Gorman, I found him to be intelligent, cool-headed, and very firmly convinced of every detail in his story. I had learned something about his background. He had had college training. During the war, he had been an Air Force instructor, training French student pilots. In Fargo, his home, he had a good reputation, not only for veracity but as a businessman. Only 26, he was part owner of a construction company, and also the Fargo representative for a hardware store chain. Even knowing all this, I found it hard at first to believe some of the dogfight details. But the ground observers confirmed them. It was about 9 o'clock in the evening, October 1st, 1948. Gorman, now an Air National Guard lieutenant, had been on a practice flight in an F-51 fighter. The other pilots on this practice patrol had already landed. Gorman had just been cleared by the CA operator in the Fargo airport tower when he saw a fast-moving light below his circling fighter. From his altitude, 4,500 feet, it appeared to be the tail light of a swiftly flying plane. As nearly as he could tell, it was 1,000 feet high, moving at about 250 miles per hour. Gorman called the tower to recheck his clearance. He was told the only other plane in the area was a Piper Cub. Gorman could see the Cub plainly outlined below him. There was a night football game going on, and the field was brightly lighted. But the Cub was nowhere near the strange light. As the mystery light raced above the football field, Gorman noticed an odd phenomenon. Instead of seeing the silhouette of a plane, he saw no shape at all around the light. By contrast, he could see the Cub's outline clearly. Meantime, the airport traffic controller, L.D. Jensen, had also spotted the queer light. Concerned with the danger of collision, he said later that he, too, thought it a plane's tail light. He trained his binoculars on it. Like Gorman, he was unable to distinguish a shape near the light. Neither could another CA man who was with him in the tower, a Fargo resident named Manuel E. Johnson. Up in the F-51, Gorman dived on the light, which was steadily blinking on and off. As I closed in, he told Project Saucer men later, it suddenly became steady and pulled up into a sharp left turn. It was a clear white and completely round, about 6 to 8 inches in diameter. I thought it was making a pass at the tower. I dived after it and brought my manifold pressure up to 60, but I couldn't catch the thing. Gorman reported his speed at full power as 350 to 400 miles per hour. During the maneuvers that followed, both the CA men watched from the tower. Jensen was using powerful night glasses, but still no shape was visible near the mysterious light. The fantastic dogfight continued for 20 minutes. Gorman described it in detail. When I attempted to turn with the light, I blacked out temporarily, owing to excessive speed. I am in fairly good physical condition, and I don't believe there are many, if any, pilots who could withstand the turn and speed effected by the light and remain conscious. During these sharp maneuvers, the light climbed quickly, then made another left bank. I put my 51 into a sharp turn and tried to cut it off, said Gorman. By then we were at about 7,000 feet. Suddenly it made a sharp right turn and we headed straight at each other. Just when we were about to collide, I guess I lost my nerve. I went into a dive and the light passed over my canopy at about 500 feet. Then it made a left circle about 1,000 feet above and I gave chase again. When collision seemed imminent a second time, the object shot straight into the air. Gorman climbed after it at full throttle. Just about this time, too, other witnesses, a private pilot and his passenger, saw the fast-moving light. The pilot was Dr. A.D. Cannon, an oculist. His passenger was Einar Nelson. Dr. Cannon later told investigators the light was moving at high speed. He thought it might be a Canadian jet fighter from over the border. A careful check with Canadian air officials ruled out this answer. After landing at the airport, Dr. Cannon and Mr. Nelson again watched the light, saw it change direction and disappear. Meanwhile, Gorman was making desperate efforts to catch the thing. He was now determined to ram it, since there seemed nothing solid behind it to cause a dangerous crash. If his fighter was disabled, or if it caught fire, he could bail out. But despite the F-51's fast climb, the light still outdistanced him. At 14,000 feet, Gorman's plane went into a power stall. He made one last try, climbing up to 17,000 feet. A few moments later, the light turned in a north-northwest direction and quickly disappeared. Throughout the dogfight, Gorman noticed no deviation on his instruments, according to the Project Saucer report. Gorman did not confirm or deny this when I talked with him, but he did agree with the rest of the project statement. He did not notice any sound, odor, or exhaust trail. Gorman's remarks about ramming the light reminded me of what Art Green had said. When I asked Gorman about the court-martial rumor, he gave me a searching glance. "Where did you hear that?" "Several places," I told him. "At Chicago, in Salt Lake City. In fact, we've been hearing it all over." "Well, there's nothing to it," Gorman declared. He changed the subject. Some time afterward, a Fargo pilot told me there had been trouble over the ramming story. But it wasn't Gorman's fault. Somebody else released that report to the AP. The news story didn't actually say there was an Air Force order to ram it, but the idea got around, and we heard that Washington squawked. Gorman had a pretty rough time of it for a while. Some of the newspapers razzied his story, and the Project Saucer teams really worked on him. I guess they were trying to scare him into saying he was mistaken, and it was a balloon. When I asked Gorman about this, he denied he'd had rough treatment by the project teams. Sure, they asked about 1,000 questions, and I could tell they thought it might be a hoax at first. But that was before they quizzed the others who saw it. "Anybody suggest it was a balloon?" I said casually. "At first, they were sure that's what it was," answered Gorman. "You see, there was a weather balloon released here. You know the kind, it has a lighted candle on it. The project team said I chased after that candle and just imagined the light's maneuvers. Confused it with my own movement, because of the dark."
Gorman grinned. They had it just about wrapped up until they talked to George Sanderson. He's the weather observer. He was tracking the balloon with a theodolite, and he showed them his records. The time and altitudes didn't fit, and the wind direction was wrong. The balloon was drifting in the opposite direction. Both the tower men backed him up. So that killed the weather balloon idea. The next step by Project Saucer investigators had been to look for some unidentified aircraft. This failed, too. Obviously, it was only routine. The outline of a conventional plane would certainly have been seen by Gorman and the men in the tower. An astronomical check by Professor Hynek ruled out stars, fireballs, and comets a vain hope, to begin with. The only other conventional answer, as the project report later stated, was hallucination. In view of all the testimony, hallucination had to be ruled out. Finally, the investigators admitted they had no solution. The first Project Saucer report, on April 27, 1949, left the Gorman mystery light unidentified. In the Saturday Evening Post of May 7, 1949, Sidney Shellett analyzed the Gorman case, in the second of his articles on flying saucers. Shellett suggested this solution, that Gorman had chased one of the Navy's giant cosmic ray research balloons. Each of these huge balloons is lighted, so that night-flying planes will not collide with the gas bag or the instrument case suspended below. Shellett concluded that Gorman was suffering from a combination of vertigo and confusion with the light on the balloon. As already mentioned, these huge Navy balloons are filled with only a small amount of helium before their release at Minneapolis. They then rise swiftly to very high altitudes, unless a leak develops. In Shellett's words, these balloons travel high and fast. Fargo is about 200 miles from Minneapolis. Normally, a cosmic ray research balloon would have reached a very high altitude by the time it had drifted this far. The only possible answer to its low-altitude sighting would be a serious leak. If a leaking balloon had come down to 1,000 feet at Fargo, it would either have remained at that height or kept on descending. The mystery light was observed at this altitude moving at high speed. If a Cub's outline was visible against the lighted football field, the massive shape of even a partly deflated balloon would have stood out like an elephant. Even before release, the partially inflated gas bags are almost 100 feet tall. The crowd at the football game would certainly have seen such a monstrous shape above the glare of the floodlights, for the plastic balloons gleam brightly in any light rays. The two CAA men, watching with binoculars, could not possibly have missed it. For the cosmic balloon answer to be correct, this leaking gas bag would have had to rise swiftly to 17,000 feet after a loss of helium had forced it down to 1,000. As a balloon pilot, I know this is impossible. The Project Saucer report said unequivocally, the object could outturn and outspeed the F-51, and was able to attain a much steeper climb and to maintain a constant rate of climb far in excess of the Air Force fighter. A leaking balloon. More and more, I became convinced that Secretary Forrestal had persuaded some editors that it was their patriotic duty to conceal the answer, whatever it was. That thought had begun to worry me, because of my part in this investigation. Perhaps John Steele had been right, and we shouldn't be trying to dig out the answer. But I had already told Purdy, and he had agreed, that if national security was involved, we would drop the thing completely. By the time I had proved the balloon answer wrong, I was badly puzzled. The idea of a disembodied light was the hardest thing to swallow that I'd come across so far. And yet there were the other light reports, the strange sighting at Fairfield Swaysan Field, the weird green lights at Las Vegas and Albuquerque. And there was the encounter that Lieutenant H.G. Combs had had one night above Andrews Field, near Washington, D.C. This incident had occurred on November 18, 1948, 6 weeks after Gorman's experience. Combs, flying with another lieutenant named Jackson, was about to land his T-6 at 9:45 p.m. when a strange object loomed up near him. It looked like a grayish globe, and it gave off an odd, fuzzy light. Combs chased the weird object for over 10 minutes, during which it appeared to evade every move he made. Once, its speed was nearly 600 miles an hour, as closely as he could estimate. In a final attempt to identify it, Combs zoomed the T-6 up at a steep angle and flashed his landing lights on it. Before he could get a good look, the globe light whirled off to the east and vanished. Since Combs's story had been in the newspapers, Project Saucer evidently had felt it wise to give some explanation. When I read it, in the preliminary report, I was amazed. Here was the concluding sentence. The mystery was cleared up when the object was identified positively as a cluster of cosmic ray research balloons. Even one of the giant balloons would have been hard to take as the explanation. Combs was almost sure to have collided with it in his head-on passes. But an entire cluster. I tried to picture the T-6 zooming and twisting through the night sky, with several huge balloons in its path. It would be a miracle if Combs got through without hitting one of them, even if each balloon was lighted. But he had seen only one light, so had Lieutenant Jackson. That would mean all the rest of the balloons were unlighted, an unbelievable coincidence. It was not until months afterward that I found Project Saucer had withdrawn this solution. In its final report, this case, number 207, was listed in the unidentified group. How the balloon cluster explanation ever got into the first report is still a mystery. When I talked with Gorman, I told him I was baffled by the idea of a light maneuvering through the skies with no airfoil to support it. I know, he said. It got me, too, at first. You mean you know the answer? I demanded. It's just my personal opinion, said Gorman. But I'd rather not have it printed. You see, I got some ideas from all the questions those project teams asked me. If my hunch turns out to be right, I might be talking about an official secret. I tried to pry some hint out of him, but Gorman just smiled and shook his head. I can tell you this much, he said, because it's been mentioned in print. There was thought behind every move the light made. It wasn't any radar responder gadget making it veer away from my ship. How do you know that? Because it reacted differently at different times. If it had been a mechanical control, it would have turned or climbed the same way each time I got near it. Instead, it was as if some intelligent mind was directing every turn like a game of chess, and always one move ahead of me. Maybe you can figure out the rest. That was all I could get out of him. It bothered me, because Combs's report indicated the same thing. I had a strong temptation to skip the space plan's research and tell Riedel what Gorman had told me. But Riedel had an orderly mind, and he didn't like to be pushed. Reluctantly, I gave up the idea. I had a feeling Riedel knew the answer to the mystery lights, and it wasn't easy to put off the solution. The letter that came from Art Green, while I was working on the space plans, didn't make it easier. Dear Keyhoe, just heard about your Seattle visit. That Fairfield Swaysan thing is on the level. Several Air Force pilots have told me about it. When you get to Fargo, ask Gorman what they found when they checked his ship with a Geiger counter. If he says it was negative, then he must be under orders. I happen to know better. Yours, Art Green. Chapter 11. My first step, in checking on our space plans, was to look up official announcements. I found that on December 29, 1948, Defense Secretary James Forrestal had released this official statement. The Earth Satellite Vehicle Program, which is being carried out independently by each military service, has been assigned to the Committee on Guided Missiles for coordination. To provide an integrated program, the committee has recommended that current efforts be limited to studies and component design. Well-defined areas of such research have been allocated to each of the 3 military departments. Appropriation bills had already provided funds for space exploration plans. The Air Force research was indicated by General Curtis E. LeMay, who was then Deputy Chief of Air Staff for Research and Development. In outlining plans for an Air Engineering Design Center at Wright Field, General LeMay included these space exploration requisites: flight and survival equipment for ultra-atmospheric operations, including space vehicles, space bases, and devices for use therein. The idea of exploring space is, of course, nothing new. For many years, writers of imaginative fiction have described trips to the moon and distant planets. More recently, comic books and strips have gone in heavily for space travel adventures. As a natural result of this, the first serious rocket experiments in this country were labeled screwball stunts, about on a par with efforts to break through the sonic barrier. The latter had been proved impossible by aeronautical engineers. As for rocket flight, it was too silly for serious consideration. Pendray, Goddard, and other rocket pioneers took some vicious ridicule before America woke up to the possibilities. Meantime, German scientists had gone far ahead. Their buzz bomb, a low-altitude semi-guided missile, was just the beginning. Even the devastating V-2, which soared high into the stratosphere before falling on England, was just a step in their tremendous space program. If the Nazis could have hung on a year or 2 more, the war might have had a grimly different ending. When the Allies seized Nazi secrets, some of the German plans were revealed. Among them was one for a huge Earth satellite. From this base, which would circle the Earth some 500 miles away, enormous mirrors would focus the sun's rays on any desired spot. The result: swift, fiery destruction of any city or base refusing to surrender. First publication of this scheme brought the usual jeers. Many people, including some reputable scientists, believed it had been just a propaganda plan that even Goebbels had discarded as hopeless. Then the Pentagon announced the U.S. Earth Satellite Vehicle Program. Along with plans for a moon rocket, the artificial satellite is to be a large rocket-propelled projectile. In its upward flight, it will have to reach a speed of 23,000 miles an hour to escape the Earth's pull of gravity. At a height of about 500 miles, special controls will turn the projectile and cause it to circle the Earth. These controls will be either automatic or operated from the ground, by radar. Theoretically, once such a vehicle is beyond gravity's magnetism, it can coast along in the sky forever. Its rocket power will be shut off. The only need for such power would be if the satellite veered off course. A momentary burst from the jets would be sufficient to bring it back to its orbit. Circling the Earth in about 2 hours, this first satellite is expected to be used as a testing station. Instruments will record and transmit vital information to the Earth, the effect of cosmic rays, solar radiation, fuel required for course corrections, and many other items. A second space base farther out will probably be the next step. It may be manned, or it may be under remote control like the first. Perhaps the first satellite vehicle will be followed by a compartmented operating base, a sort of aerial aircraft carrier, with other rocket ships operating to and fro on the Earth shuttle. The moon rocket is expected to add to our information about space, so that finally we will emerge with an interplanetary spacecraft. The first attempts may fail. The first satellite may fall back and have to be guided to an ocean landing. Or its controls might not bring it into the planned orbit. In this case, it could coast on out into space and be lost. But sooner or later, effective controls will be found. Then the manned spaceships will follow. Once in free space, there will be no gravitational pull to offset. The spaceship and everything in it will be weightless. Shielding is expected to prevent danger from cosmic rays and solar radiation. The danger from meteorites has been partly discounted in one scientific study. Probability that a meteorite will hit or penetrate a body situated in the vicinity of the Earth, by G. Grimminger, Journal of Applied Physics, Volume 19, Number 10, pp 947–956, October 1948. In this study, it is stated that a meteorite is unlikely to penetrate the thick shell our space vehicles will undoubtedly have. However, this applies only to the Earth's atmosphere. Longer studies, using remote-controlled vehicles in space, may take years before it will be safe to launch a manned spaceship. Radar or other devices may have to be developed to detect approaching meteorites at a distance and automatically change a spaceship's course. The change required would be infinitesimal, using power for only a fraction of a second. But before we are ready for interplanetary travel, we will have to harness atomic power or some other force not now available, such as cosmic rays. Navigation at such tremendous speeds is another great problem, on which special groups are now at work. A Navy scientific project recently found that strange radio signals are constantly being sent out from a hot spot in the Milky Way. Other nebulae or hot stars may be similarly identified by some peculiarity in their radio emanations. If so, these could be used as checkpoints in long-range space travel. Escape from the Earth's gravity is possible even now, according to Francis H. Clauser, an authority on space travel plans. But the cost would be prohibitive, with our present rocket motors, and practical operations must wait for higher velocity rocket power, atomic or otherwise. Flight Beyond the Earth's Atmosphere, SAE Quarterly Transactions, Volume 2, No. 4, October 1948. Already, a two-stage rocket has gone more than 250 miles above the Earth. This is the V2 watt-corporal combination. The V2 rocket is used to power the first part of the flight, dropping off when its fuel is exhausted. The watt-corporal then proceeds on its own fuel, reaching a fantastic speed in the thin air higher up. Hundreds of technical problems must be licked before the first satellite vehicle can be launched successfully. Records on our V2 rockets indicate some of the obstacles. On the takeoff, their present swift acceleration would undoubtedly kill anyone inside. When re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, the nose of a V2 gets red hot. Both the acceleration and deceleration must be controlled before the first volunteers will be allowed to hazard their lives in manned rockets. Willy Ley, noted authority on space travel problems, believes that pilots may have to accept temporary blackout as a necessity on the takeoff. Two of his books, Rockets and Space Travel and Outer Space, give fascinating and well-thought-out pictures of what we may expect in years to come. Some authorities believe that our space travel will be confined to our own solar system for a long time, perhaps forever. The trip to the Moon, though now a tremendous project, would be relatively simple compared with a journey outside our system. Escape from the Moon, for the return trip, would be easier than leaving the Earth, because of its smaller mass. To escape the Moon's gravitational pull would take a speed of about 5,000 miles an hour, against 23,000 for the Earth. Navigation would be much simpler. Our globe would loom up in the heavens, much larger and brighter than the Moon appears to us. Radar beams would also be a guide. The greatest obstacle to reaching far-distant planet is the time required. In the Project Saucer study of space travel, Wolf 359 was named as the nearest star likely to have possibly inhabited Aries. Wolf 359 is 8 light-years from the Earth. The limiting speed in space, according to Einstein's law, would be just under the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second. At this speed, Einstein states, matter is converted into energy. It is a ridiculous assumption, but even if atomic power, or some force such as cosmic rays, made an approach to that speed possible, it would still take 8 years to reach Wolf 359. The round trip would take 16. There have been a few scientists who dispute Einstein's law, though no one has disproved it. If the speed of light is not an absolute limit for spaceships, then travel to remote parts of the universe may someday be possible. Otherwise, a trip outside our solar system could be a lifetime expedition. Most space travel would probably be limited to the planets of our Sun, the Moon, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, and the others. Although it may be many years before the first manned spaceship leaves the Earth, we are already at work on the problems the crews would face. I learned some of the details from a Navy flight surgeon with whom I had talked about takeoff problems. They are a lot further than that, he told me. Down at Randolph Field, the Aeromedical Research Lab has run into some mighty queer things. Ever hear of dead distance? No, that's a new one. Well, it sounds crazy, but they figured out that a spaceship would be going faster than anyone could think. But you think instantaneously, I objected. Oh, no. It takes a fraction of a second, even for the fastest thinker. Let's say the ship was making 100 miles a second, and that's slow compared with what they expect eventually. Everything would happen faster than your nerve impulses could register it. Your comprehension would always be lagging a split second behind the spaceship's operation. I don't see why that's so serious, I said. Suppose radar or some other device warned you a meteorite was coming toward you head-on. Or maybe some instrument indicated an error in navigation. By the time your mind registered the thought, the situation would have changed. Then all the controls would have to be automatic, I said. I told him that I had heard about plans for avoiding meteorites. Electronic controls would be faster than thought. That's probably the answer, he agreed. Of course, at 100 miles a second it might not be too serious. But if they ever get up to speeds like 1,000 miles a second, that mental lag could make an enormous difference, whether it was a meteorite heading toward you or a matter of navigation. One of the problems he mentioned was the lack of gravity. I had already learned about this. Once away from the Earth's pull, objects in the spaceship would have no weight. The slightest push could send crewmen floating around the sealed compartment. Suppose you spilled a cup of coffee, said the flight surgeon. What would happen? I said I hadn't thought it out. The Randolph Field Lab can tell you, he said. The coffee would stay right there in the air. So would the cup, if you let go of it. But there's a more serious angle, your breath. You'd have artificial air, I began. Yes, they've already worked that out. But what about the breath you exhale? It contains carbon dioxide, and if you let it stay right there in front of your face, you'd be sucking it back into your lungs. After a while, it would asphyxiate you. So the air has to be kept in motion, and besides that, the ventilating system has to remove the carbon dioxide. What about eating? I asked. Swallowing is partly gravity, isn't it? He nodded. Same as drinking, though the throat muscles help force the food down. I don't know the answer to that. In fact, everything about the human body presents a problem. Take the blood circulation. The amount of energy required to pump blood through the veins would be almost negligible. What would that do to your heart? I couldn't even guess, I said. Well, that's all the aeromedical lab can do, guess at it. They've been trying to work out some way of duplicating the effect of zero gravity, but there's just no answer. If you could build a machine to neutralize gravity, you could get all the answers, except to the dead distance question. For instance, there's the matter of whether the human body would even function without gravity. All down through the stages of evolution, man's organs have been used to that downward pull. Take away gravity, and your whole body might stop working. Some of the aeromedical men I've talked with don't believe that, but they admit that long trips outside of gravity might have odd effects. Then there's the question of orientation. Here on Earth, orienting yourself depends on the feeling you get from the pull of gravity, plus your vision. Just being blindfolded is enough to disorient some people. Taking away the pull of gravity might be a lot worse. And of course, out in space, your only reference points would be distant stars and planets. We've been used to locating stars from points on the Earth, where we know their position. But how about locating them from out in space, with a ship moving at great speed? Inside the spaceship, it would be something like being in a submarine. Probably only the pilot compartment would have glass ports, and those would be covered except in landing, maybe even then. Outside vision might be by television, so you couldn't break a glass port and let out your pressure. But to go back to the submarine idea, it would be like a sub, with this big difference: in the submarine you can generally tell which way is down, except maybe in a crash dive when you may lose your equilibrium for a moment. But in the spaceship, you could be standing with your feet on one spot, and another crewman might be relative to you standing upside down. You might be floating horizontally, the other man vertically. The more you think about it, the crazier it gets. But they've got to solve all those problems before we can tackle space. To make sure I had the details right, I checked on the Air Force research. I found that the Randolph Field Laboratory is working on all these problems, and many more. Although plans are not far enough advanced to make it certain, probably animals will be sent up in research rockets to determine the effect of no gravity before any human beings make such flights. The results could be televised back to the Earth. All through my checkup on space exploration plans, one thing struck me: I met no resistance. There was no official reticence about the program. On the contrary, nothing about it seemed secret. Even though it was peacetime, this was a little curious, because of the potential war value of an Earth satellite vehicle. Even if the Nazi scheme for destruction proved just a dream, an orbiting space base could be used for other purposes. In its 2-hour swing around the Earth, practically all of the globe could be observed directly, by powerful telescopes, or indirectly, by a combination of radar and television. Long-range missiles could be guided to targets after being launched from some point on the Earth. As the missiles climbed high into the stratosphere, the satellite's radar could pick them up and keep them on course by remote control. There were other possibilities for both attack and defense. Ordinarily, projects with wartime value are kept under wraps, or at least not widely publicized. Of course, the explanation might be very simple. The completion of the satellite vehicle was so remote that there seemed no need for secrecy. But in that case, why had the program been announced at all? If the purpose had been propaganda, it looked like a weak gesture. The Soviets would not be greatly worried by a dream weapon 40 or 50 years off. Besides that, the Pentagon, as a rule, doesn't go for such propaganda. There was only one conventional answer that made any sense. If we had heard that the Soviets were about to announce such a program, as a propaganda trick, it would be smart to beat them to it. But I had no proof of any such Russian intention. The date on Secretary Forrestal's coordination announcement was December 30th, 1948. 1 day later, the order creating Project Saucer had been signed. That didn't prove anything. Winding up the year, Forrestal could have signed 100 orders. I was getting too suspicious. At any rate, I had now analyzed the Gorman case and checked on our space plans. Tomorrow I would see Riedel and find out what he knew. Chapter 12. When I called Riedel's office, I found he had flown to Dallas and would not be back for 2 days. By the time he returned, I had written a draft of the Gorman case, with my answer to the balloon explanation. When I saw him, the next morning, I asked him to look it over. Riedel lighted his pipe and then read the draft, nodding to himself now and then. "I think that's correct analysis," he said when he finished. That was a very curious case. You know, Project Saucer even had psychiatrists out there. If Gorman had been the only witness, I think they'd have called it a hallucination. As it was, they took a crack at him and the CAA men in their preliminary report. Though I recalled that there had been a comment, I didn't remember the wording. Riedel looked it up and read it aloud. From a psychological aspect, the Gorman incident raised the question, is it possible for an object without appreciable shape or known aeronautical configuration to appear to travel at variable speeds and maneuver intelligently? Hallucination might sound like a logical answer, I said, until you check all the testimony. But there are just too many witnesses who confirm Gorman's report. Also, he seems like a pretty level-headed chapter. Riedel filled his pipe again. But you still can't quite accept it. I'm positive they saw the light, but what the devil was it? How could it fly without some kind of airfoil? Maybe it didn't. You remember Gorman described an odd fuzziness around the edge of the light? It's in this Air Force report. That could have been a reflection from the airfoil. Yes, but Gorman would have seen any solid. I stopped, as Riedel made a negative gesture. It could be solid and still not show up, he said. You mean it was transparent? Sure, that would do it. Let's say the airfoil was a rotating plastic disc, absolutely transparent. The blurred, fuzzy look could have been caused by the whirling disc. Neither Gorman nor the CAA men in the tower could possibly see the disc itself. "Paul, I think you've hit it," I said. "I can see the rest of it, the thing was under remote control, radio or radar. And from the way it flew rings around Gorman, whoever controlled it must have been able to see the F-51, either with a television eye or by radar. Or by some means we don't understand," said Riedel. He went on carefully, "In all these saucer cases, keep this in mind, we may be dealing with some totally unknown principle, something completely beyond our comprehension." For a moment, I thought he was hunting at some radical discovery by Soviet-captured Nazi scientists. Then I realized what he meant. "You think they're interplanetary?" I murmured. "Why not?" Riedel looked surprised. "Isn't that your idea?" I got that impression. "Yes, but I didn't think you believed it. When you said to check on our space plans, I thought you had some secret missile in mind." "No, I had another reason. I wanted you to see all the problems involved in space travel. If you accept the interplanetary answer, you have to accept this, too. Whoever is looking us over has licked all those problems years ago. Technically, they'd be hundreds of years ahead of us, maybe thousands. It has a lot to do with what they'd be up to here." When I mentioned the old sighting reports, I found that Riedel already knew about them. He was convinced that the Earth had been under observation a long time, probably even before the first recorded sightings. "I know some of those reports aren't authentic," he admitted. "But if you accept even one report of a flying disc or rocket-shaped object before the 20th century, then you have to accept the basic idea. In the last 40 years, you might blame the reports on planes and dirigibles. But there was no propelled aircraft until 1903. Either all those early sightings were wrong, or some kind of fast aerial machine has been flying periodically over the Earth for at least 2 centuries. I told him I was pretty well convinced, but that truth faced a problem. There was some conflicting evidence, and part of it seemed linked with guided missiles. I felt sure we could prove the space travel answer, but we had to stay clear of discussing any weapons that were still a secret. I can't believe that guided missiles are the answer to the Godman field saucer and the Chilis-Whitted case, or this business at Fargo. But we've got to be absolutely sure before we print anything. "Well, let's analyze it," said Riedel. "Let's see if all the saucers could be explained as something launched from the Earth." He reached for a pad and a pencil. "First, let's take your rotating disc. That would be a lot simpler to build than the stationary disc with variable jet nozzles. With a disc rotated at high speed you get a tremendous lift, whether it's slotted or cambered, as long as there's enough air to work on." "The helicopter principle," I said. Riedel nodded. "The most practical propulsion would be with 2 or more jets out on the rim, to spin your rotating section. But to get up enough speed for the jets to be efficient, you'd have to whirl the disc mechanically before the takeoff. Here's one way. You could have a square hole in the center, then the disc launching device would have a square shaft, rotated by an engine or a motor. As the speed built up, the cambered disc would ride up the shaft and free itself, rising vertically, with the jets taking over the job of whirling the cambered section. The lift would be terrific, far more than any normal aircraft. I don't believe any human being could take the GS involved in a maximum power climb. They'd have to use remote control. When it got to the desired altitude, your disc could be flown in any direction by tilting it that way. The forward component from that tremendous lift would result in a very high speed. The disc could also hover and descend vertically. What about maneuvering? I asked, thinking of Gorman's experience. It could turn faster than any pilot could stand, said Riedel. Of course, a pilot's cockpit could be built into a large disc, but there'd have to be some way of holding down the speed to avoid too many GS in tight maneuvers. Most of the discs don't make any noise, I said. At least, that's the general report. You'd hear ordinary jets for miles. Right, and here's another angle. Ramjets take a lot of fuel. Even with some highly efficient new jet, I can't see the long ranges reported. Some of these sources have been seen all over the world. No matter which hemisphere they were launched from, they'd need an 8,000-mile range, at least, to explain all of the sightings. The only apparent answer would be some new kind of power, probably atomic. We certainly didn't have atomic engines for aircraft in 1947. When the first discs were seen here. And we don't have them now, though we're working on it. Even if we had such an engine, it wouldn't be tiny enough to power the small discs. Anyway, I said, we'd hardly be flying them all over everywhere. The cost would be enormous, and there'd always be a danger of somebody getting the secret if a disc landed. Plus the risk of injuring people by radiation. Just imagine an atomic-powered disc dropping into a city. The whole idea's ridiculous. That seems to rule out the guided missile answer, I began. But Riedel shook his head. Disc-shaped missiles are quite feasible. I'm talking about range, speed, and performance. Imagine for a moment that we have disc-type missiles using the latest jet or rocket propulsion, either piloted or remote-controlled. The question is, could such discs fit specific sightings like the one at Godman Field and the case at Fargo? Riedel paused as if some new thought had struck him. Wait a minute, here's an even better test. I happen to know about this case personally. Marvin Miles, he's an aviation writer in Los Angeles, was down at White Sands Proving Ground some time ago. He talked with a Navy rocket expert who was in charge of naval guided missile projects. This Navy man, he's a commander in the regular service, told Miles they'd seen 4 saucers down in that area. You're sure he wasn't kidding, Miles? I said. Then I remembered Purdy's tip about a White Sands case. I told you I checked on this myself, Riedel said, a little annoyed. After Miles told me about it, I asked an engineer who'd been down there if it was true. He gave me the same story, figures and all. The first saucer was tracked by White Sands observers with a theodolite. Then they worked out its performance with ballistics formulas. Riedel looked at me grimly. The thing was about 50 miles up. And it was making over 15,000 miles an hour. One of the witnesses, said Riedel, was a well-known scientist from the General Mills Aeronautical Research Laboratory in Minneapolis, which was working with the Navy. A few days later, I verified this fact and the basic details of Riedel's account. But it was not until early in January 1950 that I finally identified the officer as Commander Robert B. McLaughlin and got his dramatic story. Here are 2 more items Miles told me, Riedel went on. This Navy expert said the saucer actually looked elliptical, or egg-shaped. And while it was being tracked, it suddenly made a steep climb, so steep no human being could have lived through it. One thing is certain, I said. That 50-mile altitude knocks out the rotating disc. Up in that thin air it wouldn't have any lift. Right, said Riedel. And the variable jet type would require an enormous amount of fuel. Regardless, those GS mean it couldn't have had any pilot born on this Earth. According to Marvin Miles, this White Sands saucer had been over 100 feet long. Later, Commander McLaughlin stated that it was 105 feet. If this were an American device, then it meant that we had already licked many of the problems on which the Earth satellite vehicle designers were supposed to be just starting. Their statements, then, would have to be false, part of an elaborate cover-up. If we had such an advanced design, said Riedel, and I just don't believe it possible, would we gamble on a remote control system? No such system is perfect. Suppose it went wrong. At that speed, over 15,000 miles an hour, your precious missile or strato ship could be halfway around the globe in about 4 to 5 minutes. That is, if the fuel held out. Before you could regain control, you might lose it in the sea. Or it might come down behind the Iron Curtain. Even if it were ice smashed to bits, it would tip off the Soviets. They might claim it was a guided missile attack. Almost anything could happen. It could have a time bomb in it, I suggested. If it got off course or out of control, it would blow itself up. Riedel emphatically shook his head. I've heard that idea before, but it won't hold up. What if your ship's controls went haywire and the thing blew up over a crowded city? Imagine the panic, even if no actual damage was done. No, sir, nobody in his right mind is going to let a huge ship like that go barging around unpiloted. It would be criminal negligence. If the White Sands calculations were correct, then this particular saucer was no Earth-made device. Perhaps in coming years, we could produce such a ship, with atomic power to drive it. But not now. Riedel went over several other cases. Take the Godman Field saucer. At one time, it was seen at places 175 miles apart, as you know. Even to have been seen at all from both places, it would have to have been huge, much larger than 250 feet in diameter. The human eye wouldn't resolve an object that size, at such a distance and height. It was an odd thing, I had gone over the Mantell case a dozen times. I knew the object was huge. But I had never tried to figure out the object's exact size. How big do you think it was? I asked quickly. This could be the key I had tried to find. I haven't worked it out, said Riedel. But I can give you a rough idea. The human eye can't resolve any object that subtends less than 3 minutes of arc. For instance, a plane with 100-foot wingspan would only be a speck 20 miles away, if you saw it at all.